Can you see the PowerPoint properly?
Yes, we can see it.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Natalie, for the introduction. Today, I'd like to introduce the history of segregationist policy in fascist Italian Empire. And for this, I will focus on a review that was sponsored by the government and which aim was to justify imperial expansion and to establish racism as an official doctrine of Mussolini's regime in the late 1930s. That journal is called Difesa della Razza, which means defense of the race in English. And it should be regarded as the printed testimony of one of the darkest hours of Italian history, as it sponsored anti-Semitism and violent politics of racial discriminations towards the population of the empire in Africa. So before starting, I just wanted to give once again a content warning for racist propaganda and offensive images. Although I have decided not to show the most alarming elements of the review, there will be some suggestive content here. So in summer 1938, the fascist government of Benito Mussolini launched an infamous propaganda campaign, which would lead to the proclamation of racial laws on November 17. 2 years after the annexation of Ethiopia in 1936 and the subsequent proclamation of the empire, fascist Italy operated a crucial shift in its history whilst adopting laws that were designed to support a segregationist policy and to enhance the so-called superiority of the Italian race. So here is a quick recap of the history of the fascist empire. With the establishment of the dictatorship over Italy in 1925, 3 years after becoming prime minister, Mussolini's agenda was to give Italy a recognized and secured place among the rank of great Western powers through the fortification of existing colonial possessions and further expansion. Italy had suffered heavy losses alongside the Allies during World War I, but felt denigrated as the Treaty of Versailles relegated it to the background and denied most of its territorial claims. Mussolini understood the imperatives to expand Italy's colonial sphere and to proclaim its own empire to fulfill the fascist project to revive Italy's grandeur and to establish the greatness of the Italian civilization, the same way the Romans had done with their own empire. So let's go back to these racial laws of 1938. 2 years after the proclamation of the empire then, the racial laws were implemented to permit the exclusions of the Jews from Italian society, pretty much emulating the German ally, and to strengthen the segregationist policy that was implemented already in its colonies. Racism and anti-Semitism were justified by the birth of an empire, which duty was to establish the superiority of the Italian race through dominance and a clear discriminative policy. The new laws were named Measures for the Defense of the Italian Race and were prohibiting mixed marriage, excluding Jews from their civil statutes, as well as establishing norms of everyday life discrimination in Italy and in the colonies. And that decree identified the Italians to the Aryan race in an official act, exposing therefore this desire to align Italy with the Nazi rhetoric of racial superiority. Germany was obviously the other more famous European regime that had adopted a racial policy on its territory and had become Italy's ally in 1936. Nonetheless, unlike Germany, these laws were not only designed to justify anti-Jewish persecution, but similarly to be adopted as a code of conduct within the colonies. And as a matter of fact, the declaration of the Grand Council of Fascism that had proclaimed the urgency of racial issues identified the relationship between imperial policy and Jewish discrimination by asserting that, I quote, "The conquest of the empire brought racial problems to the forefront," end of quote. So discrimination against African subjects and Jews in Italy were placed under a common pseudo-scientific denominator. Both politics became two sides of the same coin, and one could not be designed independently of the other without losing its racial coherence. And Italians were identified, as I said, to the Aryan race, and against non-Aryans, the principles of discrimination was introduced as a common rule to preserve Italy's racial coherence. To support this new policy, the Ministry of Popular Culture proposed the creation of a carefully studied racist propaganda that was meant to facilitate any legislative measures that the government deemed appropriate to take within the newly proclaimed empire. I should stress here how the media, and especially the press, were fundamental tools for fascism to create mass consensus, control, and were widely exploited in fascism's attempt to establish totalitarianism over the country. So naturally, a press campaign released a series of numerous articles that were published in the summer and autumn of 1938 in widely read newspapers. We have a few examples here, which purpose was to increase this racial awareness nationally. Still, the best example of this propaganda was the journal Difesa della Razza, Defense of the Race. The review was published as a bi-monthly magazine between August 1938 and June 1943, and was designed to back up this propaganda with the scientific expertise of a group of renowned scholars carefully selected by the regime. With a print run of more than 140,000 copies, the first issue of the magazine quickly reached schools, libraries, and all forms of state-related institutions across the country. It combines within its pages pseudo-biological, anthropological, cultural, historical studies intended to show the belonging of the Italians to the Aryan race and to demonstrate its moral and physical superiority. And the journal really insists on this idea of a biological origin of fascism's racism and aims to justify the necessity to avoid contamination between the Jews and Italians in Italy and with the non-European population of the empire. It shows a visual, disturbing stereotyping that really confirms the power of images in the context of imperial and fascist propaganda. Just looking at the first cover here, we get an idea of how photomontages, stereotypes, and caricatures were exploited to develop racial awareness through the journal. The directive board of the review was placed under the direction of Telesio Interlandi, a journalist who was famously known for his raging anti-Semitism. And in the eyes of the regime, the quality of Interlandi was perhaps his ability to bring together journalists, scientists, historians in an apparent consensus to back up the regime's position and to disseminate the new views on racism. This gave birth to a very strange amalgam of articles on blood, biological or anatomical analysis, examination of hair textures, skin, any specificities of characteristics, together with historical articles on the evolution of race, the moral and cultural aspect of different civilization, and obviously the superiority of the Italian one through history, alongside questionable art historical evaluations to show how the Italian race had always been superior through its existence. The whole thing was illustrated with photos and montage, statistics, cartography, etc. And it created a very hybrid publication at the crossroad of a scientific magazine and an art periodical, mixing studies on Italian Renaissance painting, like here, and other studies of craniometry, focusing on the differences between Africa's Black populations and Italians, for example. The use of caricatures, on the other hand, clearly places the review in an international tradition of anti-Semitic press, so dear to Nazi propaganda and initiated by the French newspaper La Parole Illustrée in 1893. So Difesa della Razza is, in this regard, perhaps the most alarming example of fascist racist propaganda. Such a publication was, of course, encouraged to facilitate the proclamation of the racial laws, but it should also be understood as the culmination of the debates around the so-called biological and moral superiority of the Italian civilization restored by fascism. I won't have time to retrace the history of fascism's ideology, but I should stress here that fascism's core ideology revolved around the idea that the Italic civilizations had always been superior, as shown by its history. And if we look at the first editorial, we read, for example, I quote, "The intrinsic logic of fascism leads to the explanation of the concept of race, as it would naturally lead to restoring Italy's faith, its strength, and its mission in the world." So, to this end, the scientific expertise appeared as the preferred way to justify the adoption of radical racial discrimination. The first edition of the journal reveals this agenda with the publication of a manifesto of Italian racism, which was signed by 10 prominent figures of Italy's scientific community. And the purpose of such document was to establish what was fascism's position regarding the problem of the race, and to come to define the foundation of fascist racism as developed by a committee of renowned scientists. As, for example, we can read the names of Lido Cipriani, who was a professor of anthropology at the University of Florence. We have Arturo Donaggio, who was professor of neuropsychiatry at the University of Bologna and also the president of the Italian Society of Psychiatry. We also have Nicola Pende, who was professor of endocrinology at the University of Rome, and many others. But this is just to give you an idea of the kind of scientists that collaborated in signing this document. Science appears therefore as the motivation behind the document. But if we read between the lines, we realize that the purpose of the manifesto is above all politic. What really strikes, apart from the anti-Semitic and racist declarations here, is that the manifesto, whilst confirming the Aryan character of the Italian population, this is point number 4, bolsters the biological origin of Italy's presupposed superiority and legitimizes fascism's ideological alignment with Nazi Germany, the National Socialist Germany. And as it appears within the pages of Difesa della Razza, the German thesis of the superiority of the blonde North Germanic race had offended the self-esteem of the Italian. Because of their cultural heritage and the vitality of the new fascist state, Italians could not have accepted being looked down upon by the Nazis, especially in the context of a military alliance. So the promotion of the Italian Nordic racism and the Aryanization of the Italian society reveals without question a complex of inferiority towards Germany's political and militaristic achievement. Difesa della Razza should therefore also be understood as an attempt to safeguard the reputation of the Italians against the Nazi rhetoric of Aryan superiority. And as we see here in the PowerPoint, there will be numerous articles that will be published within the pages of the review in an attempt to support the idea that the Italian population is also Aryan and therefore not inferior to the German population. If we go back to the manifesto, it is also essential to understand the agenda of Difesa della Razza and its program, as it clearly mirrors what would be proclaimed by the racial laws on November 1938. As proclaimed in the document on point 8, there was a need to clearly distinguish the Mediterraneans, the Western Europeans, from the Eastern ones, from the Arabs and from the Jews, and from the Africans, and to recognize the great races and small races. This is point 2. So we have measures regarding marriage that was the first constituents of the laws and were correspondingly targeting Italian unions with Jews and with subjects of the African colonies. So Difesa della Razza, through the publication, would put a special emphasis in seeing mixed unions with these populations, especially with the Jews and the Africans, as a major problem that need to be tackled. Adopting racism as an official doctrine to manage the cohabitation between Italians and native was primarily intended to minimize the risk of creating a mixed race in the empire, born out of the union between Italians and Africans. We have a speech of Mussolini here of August 1938 that was printed in newspapers that exposes how the dictator saw miscegenation as a real threat for the empire. His words reveal the fear that the Italian colonial project might engender a bastard race that is a category out of the strict racial classification the regime was trying to establish. Not Italian, not African, they would have become a threat to the prestige of projecting the image of a strong-looking Aryan nation. Fascism's project to establish civilizational authority and racial superiority could only have suffered from the image of a colonial world populated by mixed race children. And this is exactly what Difesa della Razza is trying to prevent within its pages through disturbing graphic representation of how the mixing of the different races would create a bastard population in some. So to discourage these prohibited unions, propaganda was launched to warn the population of the dangers of miscegenation for Italian racist prestige, both at home and within the empire. And in Difesa della Razza, Telesio Interlandi, the director, professed that, I quote, ultimately, the adulteration of the Italian race means the death of Italy. So to illustrate this idea, a series of articles, apart from the scientific ones, was devoted to show how throughout Italian history, foreign rulers and mixed unions gave birth to personalities who harmed the Italian race and also its international prestige and reputation. History in this context was also manipulated within the pages of the review to support the propaganda of the regime. A good example would be how the Roman emperor Caracalla was blamed for the decline of the Roman Empire, both because he granted citizenship to all free men of the empire and also because he was from North African descent. This is obviously a manipulation of history that was under no circumstances based on factual elements. But if we try to understand what really is the message of such an article, we see that the motivation was to justify how the new fascist empire should be forged on discrimination and segregation instead of assimilation, the same way Caracalla had done. We see here, therefore, that calling to historical popular imagination was thus a cultural tool designed to sponsor the whole system of anti-miscegenation and to justify segregation as much as the pseudo-scientific discourse does within the pages of Difesa della Razza. So to conclude, I would like to go back to the first edition of the review, in which Interlandi, the director, he stated that the creation of the empire was the reason behind the adoption of racism as an official doctrine in Italy. And if we focus on this aspect today, how culture and objects were instrumentalized to justify imperialism, we see how the review became an important testimony that can allow a more complete reading of the conditions in which Italy built its own empire in East Africa and Libya in terms of segregation and racial ideology. Besides the infamous anti-Semitic content present within the magazine, an anti-Semitic content that I haven't really presented today, but that should not be diminished, we have the existence of a colonial propaganda that is absolutely significant within the pages of the journal. And it really reveals how the regime carefully manipulated culture and scientific discourse in order to justify the new racist measures adopted in Italy and in the empire. And it's also a very good example of how cultural propaganda was used to establish totalitarian control. Additionally, if we read between the lines, we also see to what extent Difesa della Razza reveals the insecurity of fascism to have Italy recognized as a leading Aryan nation, so as not to be subordinated to Nazi Germany's own racial classification. And this insecurity perhaps highly contributed to fascist Italy's own participation to the Holocaust. And it should also be taken into account when analyzing the violent politics of racial discriminations that would have enormous lasting consequences on the geopolitics of Italy's former colonies in East Africa and Libya. Thank you very much.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see it. Thanks so much.
So, thank you for having me. And as you can see, my title is The Reconstitution of Transnational Adoptions, Discourses, Hybridity, and Third Space. My case study is Korean American adoptees. I dived into the process of their identity construction, and my research focuses on both the discourse surrounding transnational adoption and the portrayals of transnational adoption and how it was endorsed by media and along with judicial enforcement. So the outline for this presentation is contextualizing this research, a brief introduction to the literature review, why this topic, research aims and questions, theoretical underpinnings, mainly explaining to the fusional model of dual identities negotiation, CDS or critical discourse studies, eclectic approach. I used critical discourse studies in order to explore this topic. I used DHA, which is a discourse historical approach, and the ideological square model, along with the socio-cognitive approach proposed by Van Dyke. I used also how it was explained through my data. I presented some pictures so that you could understand the process in conducting this research. I illustrate this through my analytical patterns, and at a later stage of this presentation, it will be provided with my main findings and the contribution to knowledge, and then we will conclude. So, the context for this research, there is a huge number of adoptees going from South Korea, from South Korea to the US. The number is 200,000 children related to the literature. They were derouted from South Korea and transplanted to the US. Sorry, I can't go to the previous slide. Sorry for that. Okay, yeah. So those Korean children were displaced to the US as adoptees after the Korean War, which lasted from the 1950s to, oh, what's happening? Which lasted from the 1950s to the 1953. And then there is like what is called the wrong blood children, because Korea believed in the patrilineal bloodline. Those children born out of the relation between comfort women who were prostitutes surrounding military bases and GI soldiers were considered the illegitimate children that are not accepted in the Korean society because they were considered as a shame. So transnational adoption has become a global phenomena, and I argue, according to the literature, that it became like a global market, selling and exporting children. It has started with the Holt family, and this was depicted in media, the news briefings I'm analyzing from the 1950s, and then it became like really kind of a competition between adoption agencies. So children became commodities. They were marketed into that marketplace or global adoption market. So baby lifts were at first coming under this saving mission of children so that they give them a better life in the US or any other Western country. And then it became more of exploiting those children and having a lucrative trade behind their backs. So war orphans were derouted and displaced, transplanted into majority white background where they were expected to assimilate and to be considered as white. There is often this concept of passing as white. So assimilation is their only option. And here there is this creation of what is called like identity crisis, which I don't really agree with. It's more of like part of that process of assimilating. So according to Selman, those children represent 18% from the global adoptions, so 200,000 out of 950,000. Maki added to that those children, she considered sending and receiving countries, that those children were the largest number accepted like to the US, and the longest spanning adoptees sent from South Korea. So transracial adoption is, when I use TNA, I'm talking about this displacement from a nation to the other. But when I'm talking about using TRA, I'm talking about the racial element, how race is involved. So how they constitute how they negotiate their identities. So Korean adoptees tend to be raised as white, and this passing for white is a problem because they need to have certain skills of camouflage so that they could culturally fit in. Okay. So my research aims and questions. My first question is, how do the public discourses surrounding transnational adoptions and identity construction among Korean adoptees experiences change over time? And the second one relates to the responses to identity negotiation and how they vary from generation to generation. So here I'm studying from the 1950s, how the first generation had a different experience from the last generation in the 1990s, and how social change can shape a different experience vis-a-vis adoptees. So I delved deeper into those representations related from media, and how news briefings were meant to get the approval of the general opinion to make those adoptions happen, and how the law or the judicial system helped enforce and facilitate those adoptions. My second aim is to dig deeper into this marketization of children and how they were dehumanized and objectified so that they bring like a lucrative income for the barons of this international trade. And then my third aim revolves around identity construction. I see it as the most important one, yet it is at the third place. So how they go about to negotiate their identity among their groups, among their communities, and how they make sense of their own individual experiences within the collective frame. My fourth aim is to explore the changes in different adoptees. As I said earlier, how different generations react to adoption, and what are the differences, similarities in their context and lived experiences. So my theoretical underpinnings, I created a model called the fusional model of dual identities negotiation. So I derived the idea of third space, the concept of third space, as explained from Homi Bhabha's perspective, who is like a post-colonial theorist, and then added like that the importance of the physical geographical space taken from Sojas 2015, who emphasized that third space isn't only that space in between where people need to negotiate their identities, but also the physical space, because as Ibn Khaldun, one of a Tunisian scholar, said in the Middle Ages, the person is the result or the product of its environment. So the environment plays an important role. So the territory where they grow up bears the culture and everything that is related to creating that person's experience. And then I added Du Bois's double consciousness, which is often related to African Americans who have like a double consciousness. They have the American consciousness and the African consciousness, like their origins, and they try to understand or make sense, navigate between both and act in accordance to that. They are able to understand Americans, but Americans can't, because they are enabled to do that. So I found out from those three theories that there are three stages according to my adoptees narratives. I withdrew those narratives from the Side-by-Side project, an online website where adoptees have they tell their experiences through like long videos. I selected 20 interviews and then made sense of it through those theories. So this is a 3 stages process through which adoptees make sense of their identity and reach self-realization. So the first one is identifying their hybrid dual two-ness. This two-ness is that they are different, and it's often they reach it during their first interactions with the outside environment. Maybe they are accepted among their families, but once they go to school, they find that children don't want to play with them and they are like put aside, and this emphasize their differences. The second one is the reproductive, deconstructive, reconstructive, ambivalent stage. So here they are taking what they need from their family background, yet they are rejecting what they don't need, like those racial discriminatory acts are not accepted for them. So they are making sense of their identity, and it's often, it comes like during before adulthood and maturity, because the third one is the self-recognitive heuristic understanding. So here they develop defense mechanisms according to their lifelong experience and how they could better make sense of their identity through their experience. And it's often there when they reach maturity. So for the media portrayal, I used CDS. Like this is my contribution for the field of critical adoption studies. So here I use DHA, discursive strategies, in order to analyze some words from the news briefings. For example, poor little children, pitiful victims of war, war orphans, war waifs, war mascots. So those terms, they needed first to be like identified in a dictionary definition, and then later on, I was focusing on the words, how they were predicating war waifs to orphans, how they are nominating those people. So with that, I understood that there is a victimization and dehumanization related to children and women of war. Later on, this dehumanization and victimization moved into like telling the bright side of the story. It's kind of the US is saving those people. Look how we did that. Look at Harry Holt, the record godfather, the one, the generous, the kind. Those words are used in order to present the negative to the positive side of the story. So later on, I used to interpret this ideological square model, how the positive representation of the us is there in contrast to the negative representation of them. And this is a table I designed so that I could give you an idea how those words work. So here, the US, the homeland, it represents the new, happier life, brings him home to peaceful America. You can see, like, through the diction, how they emphasize the bright side of the story by the US side. And when we go to South Korea, the ruined streets, they roam the ruined streets, the war devastated land. It's like it brings like this idea of chaos and safe, that it's more damaging for a child. And here, this is the interpretative framework using Van Dyck's ideological square model. So when emphasizing the positive while suppressing the negative representation of the as, for example, a record godfather, big-hearted Harry, 35-year-old bachelor. This is related to Vincent Palladino, who was like a Navy man and who adopted a child. And it made like a great, it was echoed in the media during that time. And we have the negative representation of them, while the positive is suppressed. For example, pitiful homeless victims, like you can see from the diction that people would be like, will sympathize with those victims. They will try to help them in any possible way. Here, so this is the design of my thesis. I discovered that paternalism is so important as a theme. And it is related to 3 levels. Family level paternalism. When adopting those children, they have this colorblind approach. And children, they need to obey their parents. So when they tell them you are Americans and you need to act in that way, children are obliged to do so. So this is at the basic level. Then we've got state paternalism, when the state is regulating laws in order to include those external elements. So here, people generally are not okay with the fact of having racially different children there. That's why we can notice this racial discrimination outside. Even with the look, it's there. But when it's something enforced by the law and you get punished for it, it's kind of a coercive action. So the 3rd level, which is humanistic paternalism, here it represents the savior's mission, like America has. America like interfering there in order to save children, in order to provide for the poor, and it's like we could trace it from the American discourse. So I operated under this discourse paradigms, the old versus new. So from each chapter, I had like 3 main analytical phases. So I analyzed portrayals in media, the old portrayals, and the new are the narratives of adoptees themselves. So I'm opposing always the old versus new. From the adoptees' experiences, we've got at first the assimilation, and there is no acknowledgement of their differences. And then we move towards a more inclusive America and a more acknowledging phase towards their origins. And then in the approaches to transracial adoptions, we move from color blindness as an old approach to the initiation to Korean heritage culture. Here, these ties of kinship are made more important. Children are allowed to participate in Korean cultural camps. They learn Korean. They go to Korea for like having trips to Korea. They associate with other people like them, like with other adoptees, and they share this type of knowledge. And here emerges this negotiation of identity. But at like in the 1950s, with the first adoptees, it wasn't possible. So the fusional model of dual identities negotiation help understand adoptees' experiences. This collective trauma of loss and abandonment encompasses all adoptees because they feel that they were rejected when they were adopted. And then they try with understanding their identity. And here comes what I call resilience. I feel that they are more resilient because they are survivors. We don't see them as victims because this discourse of victimhood and victimization is completely not enabling them to like be to recognize themselves as outstanding individuals. They passed like through a lot. They had like to struggle, but at the end of it, they can identify themselves. So CDS, as I said, is a novelty for this new field, which is critical adoption studies, which emerged in 2018, and it relates everything that is that had been studied, in relation to adoption and transnationalism. So according to my data, the notion of paternalism is really important and it is layered. And those are the main findings of my research. And by exploring those changes in media and the life of those adoptees, we can understand that there are shifting paradigms making those individuals' experiences more articulate. And this is it. So this is just to let you know that those children were objectified, and instead of representing only names, they were numbers and file numbers. And I did this collage of pictures. They were all available online, and you can say the aspect of commodification of those children. And here is the reference list, if anyone wants to have more idea. And don't hesitate to contact me if you have any questions. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for